Well, now, and this is the spokesman you're talking about is General Bergner, who came straight from the White House to Iraq to do this job, right?
Exactly. He was handpicked because he had been working precisely with the folks who have been deciding on the propaganda line, that is to say Dick Cheney and his minions in the White House and throughout the administration.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, now the Wall Street Journal today has an article about how the U.S. is delaying a report on Iran arms. Perhaps they're having trouble coming up with the evidence necessary. But the thing that jumped out at me here is something that we've discussed in the past, which was they claim written accounts of interrogation sessions with captured Shiite militants who contend that Iraqi fighters are being trained at a facility near Tehran run by the Lebanese militia Hezbollah.
Right, and this, of course, if you think about it very carefully, you see that the subtext of this story, the real story behind the story, is that they do not have any interrogation reports that show that the Shiites are getting weapons directly from Iran. Nothing. If they had it, they would have mentioned this.
Now, the best they have is some kind of connection to Hezbollah, but they're trying to say that the connection to Hezbollah is inside Iran.
Well, it's training, and as I've said in the past, I do not doubt that Shiite fighters of the Mahdi army are being trained in both Lebanon and in Iran by the Hezbollah. There's no doubt that Sadr has a special connection with Hezbollah. He has for years. I think even before the Shiite regime came to power and the Saddam Hussein regime was overthrown, I think there was a connection between Hezbollah and the Shiite in Iraq, and particularly with Sadr and his martyred father. So I think that there's every reason to believe that, in fact, the Shiite forces of Muqtada al-Sadr have been trained by Hezbollah both in Iran and in Lebanon. But that's very different from, of course, feeding them weapons that are to be used to attack either Iraqis or Americans. I think the Iranians, as I've argued in the past, know perfectly well that, it would not be in their interest to have such weapons discovered. They would give the United States a convenient reason for attacking Iran. And secondly, they know that the Iraqi Shiites have ways of obtaining whatever weapons they need on the international market. And I'm close to 100% certain now that is exactly what has happened.
You talked about put the EFPs aside for the moment because that story has already been so roundly debunked, including in your last essay, that they displayed, 570 EFPs and then didn't try to claim that they came from Iran, which is basically an admission that they came from Iraq.
Well, yes, exactly. I mean, this was the largest cache of EFPs that I know of, which has been at least mentioned in the media, which has come to light in the media, which we know anything at all about the provenance of the EFP, and in this case, it's very clear that they were identified as not being Iranian, which means one of two things: either they were manufactured in Iraq, which is the most likely outcome, or the most likely case, or they were obtained from perhaps Hamas or one of the other groups outside of Iraq that has been manufacturing them. But it's, in my view, it's very nearly certain that they were manufactured by the Shiite Iraqis themselves.
Well, and you've gone through and cataloged before all the different reports of EFP factories being found in Iraq. I think the first one that I know of was Patrick Coburn in November of 2006.
Well, he is the first journalist, you're correct. He's the first journalist to bring out a specific find of EFPs that were manufactured in Iraq. But I had interviewed earlier and had read an article by a British specialist on EFPs, a private security company specialist who had been working on the subject for something like three to 4 years. And he had pointed out that the British had found abundant evidence that they were being manufactured in Iraq. And the evidence was that when you looked at the photographs of the way in which these EFPs exploded or penetrated or did not penetrate armored vehicles, what you saw was, in many cases, a pattern in which you had both clear penetration and spattering marks where it didn't penetrate. And what that showed was that some of the EFPs had more advanced design and others had a more primitive design, which did not work as well. And that was a dead certain giveaway that they were not manufactured in Iran, which, according to the U.S. military, had only the more advanced design of EFPs, and therefore, that would not be an evidence that they were Iranian-made. So the British were quite convinced, and in fact, they did find a number of cells of bomb makers making EFPs as early as 2005. So the evidence was there for a long time that they were being made in Iraq. That evidence was available to the U.S. military, to U.S. intelligence, and it was simply deliberately ignored in the propaganda they put out.
Well, we've discussed before how George Bush first started these lies that Iran is responsible for the roadside bombs in March of 2006, and then basically called it off. And they basically dropped that propaganda line shortly afterward, only to re-debut it in January of 2007.
Right, and I think what you've stumbled onto there, Scott, is good evidence that some people, i.e. Dick Cheney and his minions, and Bush was going along with them at that point, wanted very badly to start attacking Iran on that EFP issue, but that the U.S. intelligence community said absolutely no, there's no evidence of that. And again, in early 2007, when this issue came up again, there's no doubt that the intelligence community said that they could not support that charge. And if you go back to the NIE that was issued in February 2007, which was supposed to be on the situation in Iraq, and which, of course, covered the Iranian role in Iraq, the language that was used at that point strongly suggests that the most that the intelligence community was willing to support was a language indicating that Iran was helping to train, was providing the venue for training of Shi'ite militiamen in Iran. Not weapons being provided, certainly not EFPs.
Well, I'm sorry to ask you this, Gareth, but does it matter that all this is not true? I mean, this is no different, it doesn't seem, than the run-up to the Iraq War, where they say lies.
We know they have weapons of mass destruction. We know they have active programs. There isn't any debate about it.
We know that Saddam Hussein has a long history with terrorism.
We have facts, not speculations.
And we've been careful about what we've said, and what we've said has been exactly accurate.
We know what the fermenters look like. We know what the tanks, pumps, compressors, and other parts look like. We know how they fit together. We know how they work.
There's no doubt in my mind he wants to have a nuclear weapon, and he's got some capacity.
Sir, I think we will find caches of weapons of mass destruction. Absolutely.
There is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction. There is no doubt that he is amassing them to use against our friends, against our allies, and against us.
But there's no doubt his hatred is mainly directed at us. There's no doubt he can't stand us.
There is no doubt that Saddam Hussein's regime is a danger.
The United States knows that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. The UK knows that they have weapons of mass destruction. Any country on the face of the earth with an active intelligence program knows that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction.
And the media repeats them, and you and I sit here and debunk them, and then they go on as though nothing ever happened. Everything, John McCain will give a speech today where he announces that the Iranians are behind the killing of all our guys in Iraq, and they'll go on like this.
I think it's very clear that they're still exporting lethal explosive devices into Iraq that's killing young Americans.
Well, you're absolutely right in your overall analysis, Scott. I agree with what you've said. I think the important thing is to understand the mechanism by which these lies are created, to understand the politics behind them, to understand the mechanism by which the media goes along with it. And incidentally, it's interesting, I've just gone back recently and looked at some of the media coverage in February of 2007, and there was some very good reporting on this, which cast doubt on the initial story. But what we find is that the administration and the U.S. military command in Iraq is so persistent. They're so totally without any conscience about this. They simply repeat the lie over and over again. What happens is the media is simply worn down. They are intimidated, and they feel, well, we can't continue to simply report that this is doubtful or dubious. And eventually they simply sort of become passive spectators or passive stenographers, if you will, of the line that's being taken.